This is a CNN special report. The Reagan years, the making of a president, with anchors Jim Moret and Kira Phillips.
Welcome to this CNN special.
We're coming to you from one of Ronald Reagan's most cherished places on earth, Rancho del Cielo. It means the ranch in the sky.
This was his refuge where he came to rejuvenate himself. It was a wreck when he bought it near the end of his second term as governor of California, yet he left this small adobe house simple. It still has no indoor heating except for the fireplace. It soars almost half a mile above the Pacific Ocean, 688 acres where Ronald Reagan could let himself be swallowed up by the vast grandeur that is the western United States.
During this next hour, we're going to look at Ronald Reagan's early years and his California years.
That's where you'll find the seeds of everything he brought to the White House. We'll begin in a moment. The year Ronald Reagan was born, the Philadelphia A's won the World Series. Marie Curie won a Nobel Prize, and Irving Berlin had a hit with Alexander's Ragtime Band. The year was 1911, a time when almost every American boy believed he could grow up to become president.
The events may seem remote and far away, but the values Ronald Reagan learned as he grew up in Illinois would carry him to the White House. Ronald Wilson Reagan was born in an apartment above a bank in this small town. Tampico, Illinois, known for beautiful farm country and great pie. Life here hasn't changed much. Ronald was the second son born to Nell and Jack Reagan. The first, Neil, was born 2 years earlier. Mary Ellen Golson's father delivered Ronald in this room.
Ronald got the name of Dutch because when he was born, his dad said, well, he looks just like a Dutchman. He was a big baby, chubby.
They would become childhood playmates.
But it was fun with the ghost stories and the hide and go seek and cops and robbers. That was a lot of fun.
Ronald Reagan's young life was centered on his mother, Nell. He adored her, and she was his moral guide. Dorothy Carlson remembers that bond.
He had good Christian values. He had a good Christian upbringing. His mother was a wonderful woman, and he attended Sunday school and church regularly. And living in a small town where everyone is friendly and knows everybody, I think it makes a difference in city living, and you have more of a care and concern for people, and I don't think he ever forgot it.
A deeply religious woman, Nell was a fundamentalist Christian and member of the Disciples of Christ Church, a ministry that believed that God had chosen the American people to fulfill a special mission on earth. This would become the foundation for Ronald Reagan's political philosophy.
Reagan had taken these values. They were part of him.
Lou Cannon is the author of President Reagan, The Role of a Lifetime.
He reflected those values. He reflected the sort of historic values of America as the land of the good and the decent and standing for freedom. I think that it was what Reagan brought with him to Hollywood and to politics. I think it's what he brought with him from Dixon, Illinois. That's what clicked with people.
Nell also passed to Dutch her love of dramatics. Reagan would recall that he felt performing was his mother's first love. Nell taught her son that God had a plan for him. She taught him how to dream and to expect those dreams to come true.
I think that Reagan's mother was the key to his development, to his maturation, to his success as an adult human being.
Reagan's paternal ancestors hailed from Tipperary, Ireland. His father, Jack, a shoe salesman, was a staunch Irish Catholic Democrat who hated bigotry and racism, supported working people, and taught his sons the same. He was also an alcoholic.
Because if you're the child of an alcoholic, you see things you don't want to remember, and you certainly don't want to tell anybody. its main impact on Reagan was to create a kind of an inward part of him that was a very, very important part of his character.
But it was Nell Reagan who would teach her son tolerance.
The biggest thing that she did was that she taught Reagan and his brother to come to terms with the alcoholism of his father, which was very, very hard on Reagan.
Also hard on young Dutch was his nomadic boyhood. The family moved often through several small towns in Illinois before settling in Dixon, a predominantly working-class farm town of 8,000 people.
In his first 4 or 5, 6 years, they moved all the time. And so Reagan didn't form these friendships that you form with other children if you grow up in the same place.
Reagan was just 9 years old when the family moved to Dixon. He thought Dixon was heaven and liked to describe his childhood as a rare Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer existence. Simple life, simple times. Dutch was a short, skinny, shy kid who wore thick horn-rimmed glasses and was only an average student. But as he reached his teens, a summer job would become a defining experience in his life, forever changing his self-image. Ronald Reagan was 15 years old when he became a lifeguard here at Lowell Park on the Rock River. And as the story goes, when his shift was up and swimmers didn't want to get out, he would toss pebbles from here and yell "River Rat." But that's not the only way he got swimmers out of the water. In 7 summers as a lifeguard, he would go on to save 77 lives. Helen Lawton remembers something else Reagan saved.
One time, while he was lifeguard, a man came up to him that had been swimming, and he said, "Will you please dive in? I've lost my false teeth." He said, "I dove in and I can't find them." So Dutch dove in several times and he got it. He got them and he gave them to him, and the man was so pleased he gave him $10. And he said, "That was the first time I was ever paid for doing anything."
Ronald Reagan loved being a lifeguard. He would recall his days on Rock River with great pride. A growth spurt in his senior year of high school put Dutch at 6 feet and 165 pounds. He was football captain, drum major, member of the Dramatics Club, and class president. And he was in love with Margaret Cleaver, the minister's daughter, the girl Dutch was sure he'd marry. When Ronald Reagan graduated high school in 1928, Coolidge was president. Penicillin had just been discovered, and the movie that would win the first Academy Award for Best Picture, Wings, was playing in neighborhood theaters. And the caption under Dutch Reagan's senior picture in the Dixonian reads, "Life is just one grand sweet song, so start the music." Ronald Reagan left high school full of dreams and riding a wave of optimism, even with the Great Depression looming. After high school, Reagan enrolled in Eureka College, a small liberal arts school run by the Disciples of Christ. He excelled in just about everything except academics. He coached the swimming team, was captain of the track team, participated in student government, had starring roles in dramatic society plays, and became a surprising inspiration to the football team. Teammate Tubby Moeller remembers the team traveling to the Chicago suburbs and checking into a hotel.
We got to the hotel, and they wouldn't take the blacks.
So Dutch Reagan stepped in, perhaps recalling one of the lessons taught by his father on racial justice.
He borrowed the car from the coach or something, and he went over to Dixon, and he took those 2 colored boys there and got them well taken care of.
In his home.
In his home. And he didn't have to check with his mother or father or anything. They just did that. And that made an impression upon me. I mean, who would think of doing that?
When Dutch graduated Eureka College in 1932, the Great Depression was gripping the nation. The Lindbergh baby had been kidnapped. And the swing era had begun with Duke Ellington's "It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing." Classmate Lola Muller recalls graduation.
It's a custom when we leave college to have the ivy ceremony, and we hold the ivy in between. Everybody holds ivy, and then they come along with and cut the ivy between each person. That means we're on our own. And I just happened to be in the line near Dutch and Margaret, and they wouldn't let them cut the ivy between them.
Ironically, Margaret Cleaver broke her engagement to Ronald Reagan 2 years later. When Ronald Reagan returned to Eureka College in 1982, he said, "As far as I'm concerned, everything good that has happened to me started here on this campus." Good things kept happening to Ronald Reagan. After college, his gift of gab led to radio jobs in Iowa. And not too many years later, his taste for performing led him west to Hollywood. That's where we'll pick up our story.
Ronald Reagan's trip west was just the beginning of a longer journey, from bachelor to family man, from a New Deal liberal to what we now call a Reagan conservative, and of course from radio announcer to Hollywood actor. Just about everyone dreams of being a movie star. Sportscaster Dutch Reagan actually rolled the dice and won. Hollywood in the late 1930s, a land and a time when make-believe was real. Celebrities were treated like royalty, and the dream of big screen stardom was, for many, as contagious as it was crazy. A seemingly unlikely playground for a young Dutch Reagan? Maybe not.
In the back of his head, it was that he thought he would really very, very much like to try out for film, see if he could get a screen test. He came out to California to cover the training season for the Chicago Cubs.
That was in 1937, but soon Reagan would parlay his job as a play-by-play commentator for WHO in Des Moines into a shot at movie fame. A musician friend suggested Reagan see her agent about his secret yearning to be an actor, advice the young Reagan did not ignore. And in less than a week, he managed to land a screen test with Warner Brothers Studios.
And shockingly to him, they hired him for a 7-year contract. That was the end of Dutch Reagan, and suddenly here was the birth of Ronald Reagan.
Reagan's years behind the microphone turned out to be the perfect training for Hollywood.
He said in radio, you have to imagine things.
Stop talking, children, and finish your curly crispy.
The audience has to construct this world of its own. Reagan, he'd been a sportscaster, and he'd been recreating baseball games from telegraph reports.
In his big screen debut, Reagan played, of all things, a young radio announcer.
I'll be back with more hot news. And just between you and the microphone, it'll be red hot.
Recalling years later his first day on the set, Reagan said, quote, "Nothing I'd ever experienced, nothing I'd been through had ever produced in me the kind of jitters I felt when I stepped onto stage 8 at Warner Brothers that morning." But those jitters quickly disappeared. By the end of 1938, Reagan already had 9 films to his credit. One of them, Brother Rat, a lighthearted comedy about 3 friends at a Virginia military institute, introduced the 27-year-old Reagan to Jane Wyman.
Polite indifference from the opposite sex is the fate of a woman wearing glasses.
Well, you're not wearing them now.
With youth and good looks on their side, Reagan and Wyman were quickly anointed by the fan magazines the ideal American couple. And despite his freshman status in Hollywood, Reagan made an impression on the Screen Actors Guild, thanks in no small part to Wyman. 93-year-old Jack Dales, who knew Reagan at the time, remembers.
She told us, the board, that she really had a guy there, and that he really belonged on that board. And with Jane's recommendation, we took him.
Reagan remembers it slightly differently. He said he wasn't asked, he was drafted to represent the industry's younger contract players. Either way, his impact on the SAG board would be immediate.
I found him a very affable guy who could talk to people even when there were opposite sides and not ever get them upset.
In January of 1940, Reagan and Wyman lifted their ideal couple status to a perfect union and were married. His movie career continued to flourish, but despite an impressive record of nearly 20 films in just 3 years, he hadn't gotten past what he called being the Errol Flynn of B pictures.
I guess we can't all have charm and good looks, too.
His next role, he believed, would change that. Reagan's 1940 portrayal of George Gipp in Knute Rockne, All-American, was a dramatic departure from his previous roles. It was a part he almost didn't get. Studio execs thought he was too slight to play the legendary Notre Dame football star, but Reagan convinced them otherwise.
He really made a great pitch, and he was really very good, and they hired him as that.
Win just one for the Gipper.
In the movie, the Gipper dies prematurely from pneumonia, an ailment that almost took Reagan's life as a child. Despite his performance in the film, Reagan's career wouldn't rise to the caliber of Hollywood A-list performers, but he did solidify his all-American good guy image that made him a fan favorite. In 1941, that image was further enhanced with the arrival of Reagan and Wyman's first child, Maureen.
Let's get out and walk. It looks so pretty.
You bet.
That same year, Reagan would get another chance at an A-list film, playing the part of a small-town playboy in Kings Row.
I was an awful little toughie then, wasn't I? Oh, yes, I was. But you teased me. You tried to get fresh.
I was an awful kid, I guess.
That sweeping portrayal of pre-World War I life in the Midwest would be Reagan's last picture before a period in his life that would change America and him forever. 4 months after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, 31-year-old Reagan was called to active duty, where he eventually rose to captain in the Army Air Corps. Reagan never saw combat during World War II. Instead, he used his talents to produce and appear in more than 400 military training films. Those images of war, though created in Hollywood, left an indelible mark on Reagan later in life.
It's a zero. Check.
He was based in Culver City making training films, but he convinced himself that he was somehow there when the concentration camps were liberated, for example. Even though he only saw some of the footage, he imagined himself in the scene. And I guess that's part of his appeal. He can convince people. He's a great salesman.
During his service, Reagan and Wyman welcomed their second child, Michael, whom they adopted in 1945. A world at war didn't interrupt Reagan's filmmaking.
Open your heart, Johnny. I want to be a part of you, a part that goes with you on the battlefield.
But in the end, it would impact what followed in his life. Dealing with the bureaucracy common to a country at war was, Reagan wrote in his 1990 autobiography, the beginning of a political transformation that was born in an off-screen cauldron of deceit and subversion, and a personal journey of discovery that would leave me with a growing distaste for big government.
We're meeting it again now under the name of communism.
In March of 1947, Reagan was elected president of the Screen Actors Guild at a time when Hollywood was in turmoil, with the unions battling studios and the threat of communist infiltration bringing Washington investigations out west.
When we tag them for what they are, traitors guilty of treason.
This was the first time in his life that he was in a position to influence people, or to try to influence them, to persuade them.
As president of the Screen Actors Guild, it is my great privilege to...
Reagan's ability to move between the acting community and the studios they work for benefited both. It also exposed him to a world that would overshadow and, by some accounts, compromise both his acting career and his personal life with Wyman. The world of politics. In October 1947, Reagan testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee during the so-called Red Scare in Hollywood.
And Ronald Reagan was one of the so-called friendly witnesses who was cooperating with the committee talking about communism in Hollywood. However, Reagan did not name anybody, and so he was kind of taking an ambiguous stand. Reagan was trying to present the Screen Actors Guild as an anti-communist, very 100% American organization, so he wound up attacking some of his own members. A lot of people in Hollywood were playing this game that if we stigmatize a few people, we can protect the bigger group.
What that cost Reagan in terms of liberal support, he more than made up for in conservative allies and further fueled his political ambitions.
We can prove to the world that here in Hollywood, about 30,000 of us have been fighting against this particular infiltration for a long time.
But by 1948, Reagan's newfound obsession with politics would lead to the ideal American couple's undoing.
Jane Wyman said that one reason she divorced Ronald Reagan was that he became a bore with talking about politics. He became obsessed with politics.
Patricia Neal, who co-starred with Reagan in the 1949 British film The Hasty Heart, remembers Reagan soon after his divorce.
He was heartbroken. He really was, because he didn't want a divorce from her, but Jane wanted it.
Despite this personal setback, Reagan continued his hectic movie-making schedule.
Come on, Bonzo, I'll get you home. Now, hang on, Bonzo.
And in 1951, he starred in a comedy that, in later years, political opponents and pundits would satirize, Bedtime for Bonzo. But 1951 would forever change the 40-year-old actor-turned-activist. Mervyn LeRoy told Reagan about a young actress who he had directed in a recent film, who was extremely upset that her name was being mistakenly associated with a communist front group and needed Reagan's help.
Helen, you're angry. Yes. At the lies that are told about women.
The actress's name was Nancy Davis.
So she went to Ronnie and told him who she was and what the problem was, and that started an affair, which ended in marriage.
March 4th, 1952. 7 months later, the couple welcomed their first child together, Patricia Ann.
Say hello, honey. Hello.
Several years later, Ron and Nancy would be reunited again, this time on screen. It would also be the last film Nancy ever made.
I wanted to be sure this time, so we played it safe. Until I knew that you were Mr. Right.
He's warm, he's friendly, he's all those things. He's not the greatest actor in the world, but he was fantastic in films. He really was.
By the mid-1950s, Reagan's acting career had taken a backseat to his political aspirations, which colleagues in the industry who knew him then say is what he was better at anyway.
And they felt that, and they began to view him, I think, as more of a businessman than an actor. And you know, I don't really think that Reagan was the greatest actor in the world.
A man's talents may be used for good or evil. Exceptional talents only widen the possibilities for both.
In September of 1954, Reagan agreed to host television's GE Theater, a move that would mark the beginning of another chapter in the transformation of Ronald Reagan.
Now, until next week then, good night for General Electric.
In some ways, the decade from 1954's GE Theater to 1964's Republican National Convention were Ronald Reagan's years in the wilderness. But it wasn't aimless wandering. The journey that began in Hollywood ended in what for many people was the most shocking and unlikely place they could imagine, the California governor's mansion. That's the next part of our story. Stay with us.
The Reagan Years, the making of a president, with anchors Jim Moret and Kira Phillips.
Hollywood had always been good to Ronald Reagan. He landed some memorable parts, co-starred next to some great actors, but he couldn't convince the movie moguls he was a bona fide star, a real box office draw.
But just when it seemed like his star was setting in Hollywood, his career in politics began to rise. CNN's Charles Feldman now on how that eclipsed everything he'd done before.
Pretty good trick, huh?
Ronald Reagan needed work.
The General Electric Theater.
General Electric needed a host for a television series.
Welcome to our new home.
A host who could also double as a corporate ambassador to America.
To make sure that you and your family can live better electrically.
It was while working for GE and appearing at corporate functions across America that Reagan developed what came to be known as the speech.
Yeah, but this time I've been practicing.
A speech that would set him on the road to the governorship of California and ultimately the White House.
I have spent most of my life as a Democrat. I recently have seen fit to follow another course.
He spent 10 weeks on the road for GE. He was going all over the country, speaking to audiences.
As a newspaperman, Lou Cannon covered Ronald Reagan and has written several books about him.
No reporters were covering him. He had a chance to perfect what we all call the speech.
When the government tells you you're depressed, lie down and be depressed.
And it was a basic sort of patriotic anti-government speech, full of romantic and sentimental and very effective evocation of an American of a bygone day.
Government does nothing as well or as economically as the private sector of the economy.
In 1964, Ronald Reagan gave essentially a polished version of the speech on behalf of Barry Goldwater, the ultra-conservative Republican presidential candidate running against Lyndon Johnson. The speech, coupled with Reagan's born-again republicanism, were the propellants needed to launch Reagan's political career. While the speech didn't help Goldwater, he lost the election. The former GE host had electrified the audience.
And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves.
David Broder called it the most stunning political debut since William Jennings Bryan.
Thank you very much.
I mean, immediately, Reagan was being talked about as a candidate for governor of California because he was the most interesting and seemingly most electable person to come out of that whole Goldwater debacle.
Political consultant Stu Spencer, who would one day run Reagan's campaign for governor, was even more impressed with Reagan's 1964 speech.
Up to that point in time in political history, I'd say it was probably the biggest fundraising speech that was ever given. It was a tremendous speech for that time and place in history. And that was sort of the basis of what we call the speech from there on out. I mean, he'd tinker with it, change it, and do this sort of thing. But the basic premises of that speech were the ones he used all the way through his career.
William Clark was Reagan's chief of staff in Sacramento, and later President Reagan's national security advisor.
Certainly his wonderful delivery were such that he should be considered as a gubernatorial candidate.
But if Reagan harbored secret ambitions of high political office, he certainly didn't express it at the time. Longtime aide and later U.S. Attorney General Ed Meese.
Well, Ronald Reagan was never sure that he should be the governor of California. He wasn't sure how he'd be received by the people.
As of now, I am a candidate seeking the Republican nomination for governor.
It was not his idea. The idea came from others, came from friends, particularly in Southern California.
And particularly, 3 wealthy businessmen who pushed Ronald Reagan to run for governor.
And notably Holmes Tuttle, who was a car dealer in Southern California. A guy named Cy Rubel, who everybody's forgotten, who worked for Union Oil. And Henry Salvatore.
Is that the origin of this notion that Reagan was the product of a group of basically right-wing, wealthy Orange County Republicans who told him what to do? Is that where that came from?
Well, in the first place, most of these guys weren't from Orange County. They were from Los Angeles. In the second place, Holmes Tuttle wasn't a right-winger. He'd raised a lot of money for Dwight Eisenhower. Basically, the mythology was the mythology of Reagan's opponents in his first campaign.
Reagan's opponent in the 1966 race for California governor was the popular Democratic incumbent Edmund Pat Brown,
who's trying to become California's first 3-term Democratic governor.
Brown's son, who ironically succeeded Reagan as California's governor, clearly remembers Reagan's campaign against his father.
What sort of campaign, if you remember, did Ronald Reagan run for governor?
He ran a very media-friendly Morning in California kind of thing, hitting on the bloated budget, which, of course, California was booming. So every year the budget is bigger. He positioned himself as the custodian of old-fashioned American values.
I'm real glad to be able to talk to you folks today about the coming election. I'm sure we all agree on our candidate.
Values that the Duke, John Wayne, helped personify for his pal Ronald Reagan in a campaign ad.
He is now our candidate for governor, my good friend, Ronald Reagan.
He framed things on a large stage of good versus evil, the free America versus the communist menace. And he worked that in a very dramatic way.
How big a margin?
Oh, I won't estimate my numbers. I'll just settle, even if it's for only the point after touchdown.
But some thought Reagan too glib, too packaged, and rumors quickly spread that ever the actor, Reagan was simply reading lines written by others.
Of course, President Dewey told me not to take the polls too seriously.
Lynn Nofziger was Reagan's first press secretary.
Because they were saying that he was a dumb actor and all he could do was memorize lines, he made the decision himself in 1966 that when he went out and made speeches, he would take questions.
Do you feel that Christopher has been violating Parkinson's law the last few days?
Mr. Christopher will have to answer as to whether he's been violating, and I'll only speak for myself.
The people running his campaign were scared to death, not because they thought he was dumb, but because they thought he was ignorant about state issues and that sort of thing. But he's a very quick study, and he had some very good research people, and he stayed on top of that.
One of the ways he stayed on top was with the help of a tutor in how state government worked.
We brought in a gentleman who was a state legislator, who was a bit actor, had a sort of a rapport with Reagan, named Charlie Conrad. Charlie'd come over like Tuesday and Thursday and spend 2-3 hours with Reagan, talking about Sacramento, how a bill starts here and gets to there and goes to here and so forth. The general picture of things that someone like Ronald Reagan, who had not been in government, wouldn't know much about.
At first, Governor Brown and his people grossly underestimated Reagan's popular appeal. By the time they really started to fight back, it was probably already too late.
Okay, we gotta go. Here we go.
But fight back they did, hitting Reagan, some would argue below the belt, with a nasty ad campaign that highlighted Reagan's co-starring role with a chimp.
If I could teach this monkey the difference between right and wrong.
In the movie Bedtime for Bonzo.
By getting him to do right without hope of reward. To avoid wrong without fear of punishment.
Fred de Cordova directed that film.
When Ronnie ran for governor, the opposition used advertisements like a picture of him and a picture of the monkey and said, which one will you vote for? So all of a sudden, Bedtime for Bonzo became more of a form of derision than it was when it was just a picture.
But it didn't work. The public was ready for change. Brown had already served 2 terms, and events at the time conspired to help Reagan and hurt Governor Brown. When a near riot erupted in Watts in 1966, Brown was out of state, a potent reminder that he was also AWOL during the far more incendiary Watts riots a year earlier. Meantime, a growing anti-Vietnam War sentiment fueled unrest on the campuses of California's expansive public university system.
This small minority of beatniks and malcontents and filthy speech advocates.
Ronald Reagan was the perfect foil as the man who would ride in to recreate order on the campuses.
Yeah.
Tom Hayden, who has served as a California state senator, was a student radical at the time.
By that time, he'd gone from left to right, from a representative of left-wing unions in Hollywood to spokesperson for corporate America, General Electric.
That's part of living better electrically.
To just being kind of the law and order noble knight. And he was the conservative foil and our parents' foil against what was perceived as disobedience, breakdown, immorality, counterculture, nonsensical anti-war opposition, and the rest of it.
You couldn't scare people about Reagan the way you could scare them about Goldwater. The statement's been made is that Goldwater campaigned with a scowl and Reagan with a smile.
Ronald Reagan's smile won out, and he won by a landslide.
It was big. He made huge inroads among Democrats, and he did very well with independents and with conservatives, of course. Actually less well with traditional Republicans who came to him afterward.
Place your left hand upon the Bible and raise your right hand.
Just after the stroke of midnight on January 3rd, 1967,
and that you will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which you are about to enter.
I do.
Citizen Reagan became
Governor Reagan. I now declare you to be duly installed as governor of the state of California.
Winning the election was one thing. Actually being governor was quite another. Stay with us and see what lessons Ronald Reagan was about to learn.
voice Ronald Reagan sounded during his first inaugural address in California echoed across America. But he still had some learning to do. It was the 1960s, and he was governor of one of the biggest and most diverse states in the Union. Here again, CNN's Charles Feldman.
Probably the most meaningful words are the first three. We, the people.
In his inaugural speech in Sacramento, Governor Reagan struck a note against big government.
We are of the people. We are chosen by the people to see that no permanent structure of government ever encroaches on the people's freedom or assumes a power beyond that which has freely been granted to us by the people.
William Bagley was a Republican state legislator in Sacramento for 6 years when Ronald Reagan took office. He remembers the new governor's first years as California's chief executive.
They were disasters. He brought in people who had no idea what was going on, and they didn't want to govern. Now, you can say government ought to be smaller. You can say ought to be less taxes, ought to be less this, less that. But my good God, you ought to at least know what the hell's going on, and they did not.
And, to the surprise of some, Governor Reagan was perceived as a clock watcher.
Reagan understood, both as governor and as president, that you don't have to put in 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. If you're the chief executive, you make the tough decisions, you set the policies, and you let other people carry out the details. And Reagan is not a politician's politician. He doesn't love to talk politics. He didn't love to sit around and with his feet up on a coffee table at night trading war stories.
Instead, Reagan preferred a quiet dinner at home with wife Nancy, who by day often played bad cop to Reagan's good cop.
She was a personnel director, but she made a point of trying to keep around Ronald Reagan those people that would do him the most good, that wouldn't take advantage of his softness, because he was soft in his relationships. He'd never fire anybody. She was not above having somebody fired if they weren't producing or they were doing the wrong thing. Trying to keep people out that maybe had their own agendas and weren't going to be tied to his agenda.
While governor, Reagan pushed through the legislature a welfare reform law that took more than 300,000 Californians off the welfare rolls, while saving taxpayers billions. He appointed judges that shared his view that the judiciary ought to interpret the law, not make it. And he signed a therapeutic abortion bill despite having grave reservations. He learned some key lessons along the way, foremost perhaps that campaign talk,
The government is responsible for inflation,
often must give way to practicality.
Was he a contradiction in many ways?
He certainly dramatically increased the income tax. He doubled the sales tax, so that certainly went contrary to the rhetoric. He certainly kept the prison population down, so that sounds like liberal kind of idea. So, I mean, he was pragmatic, but his ideological clarity and consistency was such that it provided a framework that allowed him tactical retreats and deviations that enabled him to function in a practical way.
The thing about Ronald Reagan is that he was much more pragmatic as a governor or as a president than he was as a candidate for governor or candidate for president.
Almost total reform that we have achieved through this bill.
Former legislator William Bagley saw the Reagan charm work at close quarters.
As a person, he was such a damn decent guy.
You really understand the significance of this occasion?
Told jokes. He used to grab a couple of Democrats and put his arms around them and tell them jokes while we're negotiating. These guys melted.
We overheard some woman say, "Why does the governor have so many security men?" And there was a little kid standing there, and he said, "To keep him from running away."
Tell him Hollywood jokes, tell him about this or that. He was good at this. And he got their support.
But I don't think it's fair to blame the president alone for that mess in Washington. A mess like that takes teamwork.
But my gosh, he was facile enough to be able to move himself from position to position and still have the credibility and the respect of the people. You can call that outrageous politics or you can call it leadership. It's part of both.
To what degree was the governorship of Ronald Reagan a blueprint for the presidency of Ronald Reagan?
I don't think it was a blueprint for the Reagan presidency in terms of its policy content. I mean, Reagan, after all, the first thing he did in California was to raise taxes, and the first thing he did as president was to cut them. But I think it was a blueprint in Reagan's style of governance. And I asked Reagan when he was the president-elect how being governor would help him be president. And he said it was going to help him because he had learned he could work with the other party.
While it may be easy to see how Reagan's governorship helped shape his presidential years, trying to determine Reagan's legacy as California's governor is far more problematic.
And for the last time, do you have any questions?
I think it's hard to say. He stood for the proposition of diminishing government, emphasizing the free market. He certainly embodied the notion of more free market solutions and less government regulation and intrusion.
In terms of leadership and symbolism, there's a residual fondness for President Reagan. He benefits because of having that movie star quality.
The only thing that's gone up more than spending is crime.
Being able to play a governor or play a president and communicate quite well. If you ask people beyond that what the legacy was in California, substantively, I think they would say that they don't know, and I'm not clear what the legacy was.
His supporters saw it differently.
I think Ronald Reagan's greatest accomplishments as governor of California, first of all, was to preside over the state, to govern the state at a very difficult time. This was during the Vietnam War. There was a lot of problems on the campuses. It was a time of considerable turmoil in the cities, and it was to govern the state with a fair but at the same time a firm hand. And also, of course, he saved the taxpayers a great deal of money, which he returned to them in, I think, 3 different tax refunds during the time that he was governor.
He left the state with a very good feeling about themselves and about the opportunities in the future here.
But by the time Ronald Reagan left the State House, after 2 terms in office, the voters of California were going through yet another sea change. This time, they voted for the son of the man Reagan had beaten 8 years earlier, a man as different from Reagan as ice cream is from pickles.
It was near the end of the second term in Sacramento when Ronald Reagan bought this ranch. But he wasn't ready to retire and ride off into the sunset just yet. Instead, he was gearing up for the ultimate challenge, a run for the White House.
By the mid-1970s, Ronald Reagan's life and experiences had shaped his vision for America.
I'm Kira Phillips.
I'm Jim Moray. Thank you for joining us.
Next Sunday, the presidency of Ronald Reagan, the major events and the perspectives of those who led the Reagan Revolution, the Reagan years, inside the White House, next Sunday, 10 Eastern on CNN.